Look at the names that ran the Cherokee Nation as it fought hardest to survive, and something stops you cold. Ross, Ridge, Adair, Vann, Mays. Not the names most people expect at the head of a native nation. They sound like they belong on a Scottish tombstone, and yet these were the men who wrote the Cherokee Constitution, negotiated with presidents, led their people down the Trail of Tears, and rebuilt a nation from the ruins. One of these families produced a chief who was almost entirely European by blood, and he became the most powerful Cherokee who ever lived. How does that happen? How does a native nation end up ruled by men with English and Scottish surnames? The answer is one of the most fascinating and least understood stories in American history. And it starts with a single fact almost nobody is taught. The Cherokee were a matrilineal society. Your clan, your identity, your belonging, all of it came through your mother, not your father. So, when Scottish and English traders began arriving in Cherokee country in the 1700s and marrying Cherokee women, their children were born fully Cherokee. Not half, not part. Cherokee, through the mother's line, with all the status that carried. And they inherited something else from their fathers, a foreign surname, and a foothold in two worlds at once. Those children, and their children, became the ruling class of the Cherokee Nation. Here are 10 of their names. Number 10. Buffington. It sounds like an English market town, and the surname is English in origin. But Thomas Buffington was principal chief of the Cherokee Nation at the turn of the 20th century, from 1899 to 1903, in the most dangerous years the nation had faced since removal. He governed as the United States was actively dismantling tribal government to force Oklahoma statehood into being. That is not a small assignment. That is trying to steer a nation while the ground is being pulled out from under it. Buffington had served as a Cherokee senator and a district judge before he ever became chief, a career built entirely inside Cherokee institutions under a thoroughly English name. He was born in the Going Snake District, in the heart of the Cherokee Nation in Indian Territory, and he lived his whole life inside its world. His English surname was simply the name he had inherited, the way any of us inherit a name, without it saying a single thing about where he actually belonged. And here is the detail that sets the pattern for this whole list. The name came from a father's line. The belonging came from the Cherokee side. The two were never in conflict. If Buffington is in your family, the name points one direction, and the bloodline may point another entirely. The next name sounds even more foreign, and it belonged to a Confederate general. Number 9. Waddy. Strip away the spelling and you find something older, but by the 19th century the family carried it as a plain, hard, two-syllable surname, Waddy, and Stan Waddy carried it into history. He was a Cherokee leader who sided with the Confederacy during the Civil War, rose to become a brigadier general, and holds the grim distinction of being the last Confederate general in the entire country to surrender, more than a month after the war was effectively over. His brother, born Buckwati, took the name Elias Boudinot, an English name borrowed from a northern philanthropist, and became one of the most important Cherokee writers and editors of his era. One family, two surnames, both European in flavor, and a place at the absolute center of the Cherokee Nation's most violent internal split. That is the twist with the Waddy line. This was not a family on the edge of Cherokee power. This was a family that helped tear the nation in half and then helped rebuild it. The next name is where the story turns to blood and betrayal. Number 8. Ridge. This one at least sounds like it could be a translation, and it partly is, but by the removal era the family wore it as an English surname, and it belonged to some of the most powerful and most tragic figures in Cherokee history. Major Ridge was Speaker of the Cherokee National Council, one of the wealthiest and most respected leaders of the nation. He and his son John Ridge signed the Treaty of New Echota in 1835, the document that surrendered Cherokee land in the east and set the Trail of Tears in motion. They believed removal was inevitable and signed to get the best terms they could. Most of the nation saw it as treason, and under Cherokee law, surrendering national land without authority carried a death sentence. In 1839, both Major Ridge and John Ridge were assassinated. That is the weight this surname carries. The Ridge name is tied to the single most divisive decision in Cherokee history, and to the blood price the family paid for it. If this name runs in your family, it runs straight through the fault line that split the nation. The next name is the one that opposed them and won. Number 7. Ross. Here is where it becomes almost impossible to believe. John Ross was principal chief of the Cherokee Nation for nearly 40 years, longer than anyone else in the nation's history. And he led his people through removal, through the Trail of Tears, and through the Civil War. And by ancestry, John Ross was 7/8 Scottish. His father was a Scottish immigrant trader. He spoke the Cherokee language poorly. He was raised in English, educated by white men, and lived like the wealthy frontier elite. And he became the single most powerful Cherokee leader who ever lived, the fierce opponent of the Ridge faction, the man who fought removal to the bitter end and then held his shattered nation together in the West. Think about what that means. A man who was, by blood, almost entirely European, chosen again and again to lead a native nation because in Cherokee eyes, blood fraction was never the point. Loyalty was. Belonging through the mother's line was. Ross proved it. His nephew, William P. Ross, Princeton-educated and first in his class, founded the Cherokee Advocate newspaper and followed his uncle into the chief's office. The Ross name did not just appear in Cherokee leadership. For a generation, it defined it. And the reason a 7/8 Scottish man could command the loyalty of a native nation is the same reason it runs through this entire list. Blood quantum was a European obsession. To the Cherokee, what mattered was your clan, your mother's line, and whether you stood with your people when it counted. By that measure, John Ross was as Cherokee as anyone alive. The next name helped him build the government itself. Number 6. Lowry, sometimes spelled Lowery or Lowry. The surname is Scottish and English in origin, and George Lowry wore it while standing at the very center of Cherokee Nation building. He served for years as assistant principal chief, the second highest office in the nation, and he was there in the room for the writing of both the 1,827 and the 1,839 Cherokee constitutions. Let that register. When the Cherokee Nation sat down to define itself in writing, to create a modern constitutional government with 3 branches and a written code of laws, one of the men holding the pen carried a Scottish surname. Lowry was also a translator, a bridge between the Cherokee-speaking world and the English-speaking one, which was exactly the kind of dual-world skill these mixed heritage families specialized in. That is the quiet power of this name, not the drama of a battlefield or an assassination, but the founding architecture of the nation itself. If Lowry is your name, your line may reach into the very framing of Cherokee law. The next name carried that same architect's role into the nation's darkest financial fight. Number 5. Bushyhead. Now the pattern deepens. Because this surname is not English at all in sound, and yet the family behind it traces to a Scottish emigrant named Ludovic Grant, who came into Cherokee country around 1726 and married into the nation. That single Scottish trader's descendants became one of the most prominent families in Cherokee history. Dennis Wolfe Bushyhead served as principal chief from 1879 to 1887 through the era of railroad expansion, cattle leases, and relentless pressure on Cherokee land and money. He fought to protect the nation's revenue and its sovereignty at a time when everyone from Washington to Texas cattlemen wanted a piece of Cherokee territory. The Bushyhead name shows you how deep the roots of these families ran. A Scottish trader in the 1720s, and more than a century and a half later, his descendant sitting as chief. That is not a foreign name that visited Cherokee power. That is a foreign name that became Cherokee, root and branch. The next name turned leadership into a family dynasty. Number 4. Mays, English in origin, and it produced not one Cherokee chief but 2 brothers. Joel B. Mays served as principal chief from 1887 to 1891, and his younger brother Samuel Houston Mays served from 1895 to 1899. Their mother was Nancy Adair, of Scots Cherokee descent, and through her, the family belonged to the Deer clan because, once again, status came through the mother. The Mays brothers were descendants of the Treaty Party families who had migrated west, tied by blood and marriage to the Adairs, the Boudinnots, and the Ridges. A whole web of European surnamed families, intermarried across generations, passing the leadership of the Cherokee Nation among themselves. That is the real revelation of this list. These were not isolated individuals with foreign names. They were a connected ruling class, a Cherokee aristocracy that happened to carry the surnames of Scottish and English traders. If Mays is your name, you may descend from a genuine Cherokee political dynasty. The next name was woven through all of them. Number 3. Adair. This is one of the oldest and most important names in the entire story, and it is unmistakably Scottish. The Adair family descended from a Scottish trader who married into the Cherokee, and over generations they became one of the nation's core leadership families. William Penn Adair was a Cherokee statesman, a Confederate colonel, and a second chief who represented the nation in its endless negotiations in Washington. The Adair name is stitched into the Treaty Party, into the migration west, into the marriages that produced chiefs like the Mays brothers. There is a reason an entire county in Oklahoma is named Adair. This was a family whose Scottish surname became synonymous with Cherokee political power across the whole 19th century. And here is the thing: to hold on to the name is so common in Cherokee history precisely because these families were large, powerful, and deeply intermarried. If Adair is in your Miley, the trail may lead back to one Scottish trader and a Cherokee woman whose clan gave their children a nation. The next name built the nation's fortune before it built its leaders. Number 2. Vann. Short, blunt, and English-sounding, the Vann name belonged to one of the wealthiest families the Cherokee Nation ever produced. James Vann was a Cherokee leader and businessman of mixed ancestry who, by the early 1800s, had built one of the most impressive plantations in the entire Southeast, a brick mansion that still stands in Georgia today, worked, it must be said, by enslaved people, because the wealthiest of these families were also slaveholders. His son, Joseph Vann, was so rich he was nicknamed Rich Joe Vann. The Vann name represents the economic engine of this ruling class, the trade connections, the plantations, the wealth that let these mixed heritage families dominate Cherokee politics for generations. Money and leadership ran together, and the Vanns had both. The name still marks Cherokee families and Cherokee history today, and the Vann House in Georgia is now a historic site people can still visit. It stands as a strange and complicated monument, proof of how wealthy and powerful these mixed heritage Cherokee families became, and a reminder that their story does not fit any simple version of history. And the story of that wealth, built on enslaved labor inside a native nation, is a whole dark chapter of its own. But we have arrived at the final name, and it is the one that ties every thread of this list together. Number 1. Hicks. It sounds like the plainest English name imaginable, almost comically ordinary, and it sat at the very top of the Cherokee Nation at the hinge of its entire modern history. Two Hicks brothers, Charles and William, both served as principal chief in the 1700s and 1800s, and Charles Hicks in particular was one of the most influential leaders of his generation, a mentor to the young John Ross, a devout convert, and a driving force behind the nation's move toward a written constitution and a centralized government. When Charles Hicks helped guide the Cherokee toward becoming a modern constitutional nation, and then mentored the very man who would rule it for 40 years, he was standing at the exact pivot point where the old Cherokee world turned into the new one. And he did it under a flat, unremarkable English surname. That is the final revelation of this entire list. The most ordinary-sounding name of all sat closest to the center of power at the most important moment. Hicks, Ross, Ridge, Adair, Vann, Mays, Lowry, Bushyhead, Waddy, Buffington, every one of them a European surname, every one of them, by the measure that actually mattered to the Cherokee, fully belonging. So look at those names again. Because they explode a myth most people carry without realizing it, the idea that a native name and a European name are opposites, that you are one or the other. The Cherokee ruling class proves how false that is. These were men with Scottish and English surnames who spoke for a native nation, wrote its laws, signed its treaties, led its people through catastrophe, and were buried as Cherokee. Their names came from trader fathers. Their nation came from Cherokee mothers. And the two were never in contradiction, because belonging was never about the fraction of blood or the sound of a surname. It was about the line you came through and the people you stood with. If your family carries one of these names, Ross, Vann, Adair, Hicks, Mays, any of them, do not assume the English sound of it tells the whole story. Behind an ordinary surname, there may be a Cherokee mother, a clan, a nation, and a place in one of the most dramatic survival stories in American history. Tell me in the comments which of these names is yours, and where your family traces back to the town, the district, the role, the story you grew up hearing. And subscribe, because there is another nation, another set of names, and another hidden ruling line waiting to be decoded, and next time, the surname on the mailbox might be yours.